Welcome to 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Dr. Vivian Carlin, and I'm joined by my dear friend and co-host, Dr. Sylvia Bank. Between our two households, we're navigating life with 10 children, so we know how chaotic parenting can be. As Johns Hopkins trained pediatricians, we also know the science. Our goal is to bring you the best of both worlds, medically sound, trustworthy advice, and practical, real-world insights as we dive into the trials and triumphs of parenting. Please note this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment from your doctor.
Today, we are doing our third episode in a series on executive functioning. So today's episode on executive functioning is really going to focus on tips and tricks and things that you can do as a parent to improve executive functioning skills in your child. If you haven't yet heard our first two episodes on executive functioning, I advise that you go back and listen to those first. In the first episode, we define what executive functioning is and tell stories about what executive functioning can look like in any child who's going through some transition difficulties, mainly in the middle school ages. In the second episode, we actually hone in on what executive function difficulties look like in a child that has ADHD. Today, I would like us to talk about executive functioning practice and skills that we can work on in our own homes. And Vivian, I can't wait to hear your stories and your tips on this one.
Yeah, so one of the ways I like to think about this is, as you know, as some of our listeners know, I homeschooled my children for about a decade. And one of the great things about homeschooling is you kind of see each child individually and what their academic needs are or what their other needs are. And then you can really tailor what they're learning based specifically to that child, right? So when I had these children with ADHD who were having these difficulties with what we would now call executive functioning, I remember feeling this weight of, as a homeschooling parent, I actually don't care at what age you learn to read or at what age you're doing Algebra 1. If you cannot figure out how to consistently follow the rules, we have much bigger problems, right? This needs to be like a high level priority in my teaching you, right? This is a big deal. We need to be working on this. This is now part of your education. It's not just naturally coming. This is part of what I need to be teaching you as a homeschooling mom. So you and I, throughout, as we've talked about executive functioning, have talked about this principle of we want to set them up for success, right? Ultimately, we want them, whether it's at school or at home, to be achieving on a level that is appropriate for them without being overwhelmed by frustration that they can't get it right, frustration that they can't turn in the homework, frustration that they can't follow the rules. We're trying to prevent them from feeling like a failure. I guess that's another way to put it, right? While this is developing. So, we've given some practical examples of things that we did, but let's dive just a little bit deeper. So first of all, at those young ages, those elementary school ages, books and games are great ways to work on that nonverbal memory, self-control, flexibility, all of those things. So I think about even into middle school, as much as I have time with my children, I love doing audiobooks. I loved this with my children with ADHD because it's a shared experience that requires some level of attention. And then if you pause it and ask, hey, what do you think is going to happen if this person, goes off into that car with that stranger or whatever?
Right.
You can almost see over time that development of this ability, which is so important in executive functioning, to take what you've learned in the past and apply it forward to the future of, ooh, that's not a good idea. Oh, they should really go this, or clearly that's the person that's the culprit in this story, right?
Right.
That ability to take the story and kind of process it in that ways, even at those young ages, is a really great way to be working on that memory aspect of executive functioning, amongst other things, right? Of executive functioning skills.
I like your example of game playing as well. And in a very low consequence environment, if you're playing something like a game of life and you're stopped and you're like, do you want to go to college? That's the first thing that they ask you.
Yeah.
And it teaches the kids to plan ahead. Maybe one iteration of the game, they didn't do that. And the next iteration, they did that. And then they know how to plan in this set game that they've done a million times, right? So game playing helps them plan for the future, at least for the purpose of the game. And it gives them that cognitive ability to start thinking that way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll highlight, gosh, one of the games that's really incredible for developing this memory skill that we came about really as a benefit of being home over the pandemic and everybody being home and having so much time. But I found both of my children with ADHD really enjoyed was chess. And if you think about like that ability in chess, you've got to remember how all the pieces move. You have to be able to project like forward multiple steps, right? Like this is really any game of chess is working on that ability for that like working memory and projecting how your actions affect the future.
Right. And the planning ahead. I want to do this to their queen. These are the steps that I need to do to get there. Like that's great.
Yeah. And, even my child who would just very impulsively move pieces and play, that is still such an act of like remembering how every piece moves, looking at the board and figuring out this piece can move this way, right? Even back in this elementary step of learning how to play chess and still be gaining those skills of this working memory that helps further in executive functioning.
And it also teaches them lessons on that impulsivity. Oh, I impulsively did this move and I lost my queen or I got checkmated. Then it's relatively consequence free, right? You've done something impulsive. Oh, I lost the game. Then next time, maybe you'll remember. It gives them constant ability to try things out, to learn lessons that are very low consequence, where later on, if the consequence is bigger, hopefully they've learned to internalize some of these lessons, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think at those early ages and then all the way through, any in-person time they can have with peers, socializing, is so beneficial. We really have to fight so hard to keep our kids in the real world and not the virtual world. And honestly, if you think about it, recess, and as much as that's been cut back, is actually a really good time to be developing executive functioning social skills. And that flexibility. It is a completely unstructured time during the school day, which is often hard for kids that struggle with executive functioning. And it's like an important educational piece to be able to go out on the playground with all of these people and all of these variables that are constantly changing and figure out what you're going to do and how you're going to interact with people without the teacher watching over you. So I feel like that unstructured play used to just happen naturally for those of us in the 80s and 90s, and it doesn't anymore, and we have to fight for it. So I feel like that's another way to help start with this executive functioning training at those younger ages.
Yeah, I also feel like that's a good platform for parents to springboard conversation and maybe some lessons where, your child is out of your care during the school day, but talk to them about lunch, talk to them about recess. What did you do? And you can offer some coaching from that perspective if they say, I had no one to play with. Well, let's talk about, let's look around, give them little assignments every day. Well, where was your friend so-and-so? Tomorrow, I want you to look for them and come back and tell me what they were doing. Little lessons here and there to teach them every step of the way of how to execute in this unstructured way.
Yeah, and to take your point a step further in that child with ADHD, who we know often, I've said this before, is kind of living in the now and has trouble accessing that memory of the past, like just asking about the day, getting them to try, and it'll be difficult for some kids, but trying to get them to reflect back and tell you anything about the day. That's such a good way to also, in like an unstructured way, be helping develop that memory at these early ages. Like, tell me about what you just did. Tell me about your day. That act of looking back, remembering, and then verbalizing it is really important too.
Yeah. No, I love it in your family how I know you guys do like your high and low from the day. Even if you don't remember every nuance of the day, focus on your best part of the day and the worst part of the day.
Yes.
Let's just start with that, right? We don't have to remember what your best friend ate for lunch, right? Let's start with your highs and lows, and we can go from there.
Right, exactly. In the second half, let's just share some more tips and tricks for parents and what they can do in the home to promote development of executive functioning skills. I think as they get a little bit older, I think that chores and responsibility at home is also a very good way to start training in executive functioning and start in that idea of preparing for job readiness. Yes. Now, it can also be very much a challenge in a child that has trouble with executive functioning, right? So one of my tricks is to really focus those in on take advantage of their areas of self-motivation, right? So as soon as they're ready, anything that involves hygiene, personal care, you want to be like transitioning that fully independent. As soon as they're old enough to safely go take a shower on your own, go take a shower. Like it may not be perfectly done, but I want to start transferring these responsibilities to you as soon as you can, with the hope that, like my daughter voiced at some point, it's so important to her that she doesn't have to be reminded anymore. She just does it all on her own. Another big area that is an easy one for me to transfer to my children, that is an area of their personal self-interest, is laundry, which is actually a really valuable in a home with a lot of people. Starting around 6th grade, I transition all of my children to doing their own laundry. I know you have a similar system, but when I think about it, with the child with ADHD who has difficulty with executive functioning, there's a lot of pieces that go into that. Okay, I have to collect the dirty clothes somewhere instead of just throwing them all around the room. I have to project that, ooh, if I don't do laundry, I don't actually have anything that I want to wear anymore. Right. It's a multi-step job that nobody really likes, but that they can be personally invested in because they don't want to smell or look bad. And I always do that when I transition laundry, and having transitioned children to laundry with ADHD and without ADHD. As a parent, I find the rule I set with my kids is, as long as you look presentable and you don't smell, I don't care how frequently you do your laundry. Yeah. I don't care if you put your laundry away in your dresser or in your closet. It can stay in the laundry basket. You can self-manage all of that. It can't be down in the washing machine. You have to get it all the way to completion. But if you just want to keep it in a laundry basket in your room for 2 weeks until you do laundry again, I'm okay with that, as long as you look presentable and you don't smell. That's my only requirement.
Right. I feel like as they're developing these executive functioning skills, it's really hard as a parent to let go of control of those things, especially when they do those things badly.
Yeah.
They're not doing it the way that you want them to do it. It is a very natural inclination for parents to sweep in and just do it for them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But you're taking away from them their ability at low levels to start executing their executive functioning, that when the stakes are very large and they've never practiced on these things, it's not going to be done well. And it leaves you to this place. If the scaffolding that your children have is that you do everything for them, that scaffolding can never come away. You need to start allowing them the ability to try to do some of these things at low consequence and stake, even if they're doing it badly or not to your standards, right?
Right.
That's very hard to do.
It is, yes. And I do take with that laundry example, I do modify for each child as needed. So there are children that they don't get access to any kind of sport uniform or anything desperate until they're in high school, right? Or any dress clothes, anything that they mess up. I just can't. There are children where I just have to hold off another year because the risk that a lizard or a Sharpie are going to go through my washing machine is so high that I'm not ready to take that risk yet. So I say all these things as generalizations, right?
Yeah, but you adapt your step-by-step process to the appropriate level of the child, right?
Yeah. And we at some point should do an entire episode on chores. I don't just stop at laundry, but I'm just saying there are easy ones there where you can tap in on their own personal areas of interest and their own self-motivation for these kids where it's difficult to get them to do these things. One more area like that is food. So as soon as they're old enough to do their own food prep in the microwave or packing their lunch or whatever it is, then I am fully supportive. I make dinner. I expect them to sit down with us and eat some of dinner, if not maybe a good amount of dinner, but if they want something beyond that and they're old enough, I love transferring that responsibility too. And there's some steps in that. There's some forward planning. I tell them, if you want something in particular, you have to tell me so that
Right.
I can get it at the grocery store because I'm the one doing the shopping. And then you can be excused from the table and you can go heat up whatever your other thing is in the microwave. Like I love transferring that responsibility too. That breakfast, I switch them all to doing their own breakfast as well. Like that's an easy one for them to do. And again, it's a chore, it's taking some of the work off of the family, but in an area where they're self-motivated. So I'm not combating some of that ADHD that's going to butt up against me as refusing to do this.
Yeah. No, I like those examples. And there's a way of just kind of like parenting skills. If parents are worried about executive functioning in middle school, there are things that you can start on even earlier on to just get them organized, thinking through these steps and working on them in a developing skill as they progress, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Two overarching things that I'd like to say about ways to help children with executive functioning. The first is, I think there's a lot of times with any issues with kids, the idea comes up of, do they need therapy? And I think that when we're particularly talking about executive functioning, if a child is going to have some kind of therapy, it's really important to have a parent involved because so much of executive functioning also hinges on this idea of working memory. So like traditional cognitive behavioral therapy, where we sit down, like I did with the remote example that I gave, where I sit down with you and I'm like, why did you take the remote apart? Do you understand the consequences of taking the remote apart? Okay, in the future, if you take the remote apart, do you understand that this is what's going to happen? Like very similar to kind of like a behavioral therapy session. That is important to do, but it doesn't necessarily work in the way that we think of it working in like depression and anxiety, because in the moment when the stimulus happens again, it's not remembered. So I think a really good therapy about executive functioning involves a parent also being coached on, hey, these are some ideas for how you can scaffold your child while we're building up these skills.
No, I like that.
And then the other thing I'll say is that we know with all children, but particularly children with ADHD, screens are addictive. They are even more addictive to the ADHD brain that is seeking stimulation. And screens are a inhibitor of executive function development. I think there has to be an emphasis on being very careful about screens. And I'm very sensitive to the fact, having children with ADHD, that screens is also a mode of survival for families and parents when you have children that are neuroatypical. And I would refer people back to our screens episode where I feel so strongly like there are times that you use screens, you make them as least stimulating as possible. So can it be a flat screen on the wall, like removed from the child, not a handheld device? Can it be a nature documentary or something like educational, not the like hyper stimulating, fast paced cartoon? And then can it be some kind of shared experience where there's people in the room and then you talk about what's happening on the screen, or afterwards you retell the story, right? Like, yes, there's ways to use screens for survival and make them as least stimulating as possible. But as we get into these middle school ages and kids are starting to get phones, I would hold off on the phone. Like all of these things, there always needs to be a mindset of, for your executive functioning development, we need to be super careful about how much your brain is engaging in screens.
Yeah, and that being said, when we were talking about games and chess and that being a developing skill for executive functioning, parents, I've definitely heard them default to, oh, they're just playing games on their screen. It is a different way. It triggers different parts of the brain, and playing a real game versus playing a video game, I think are two different things.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't want to undersell the difficulty that parents experience when their child is struggling with this skill, how they have to let go of their expectations of either perfection or having the organization done their way, and giving your child the space to develop this. And the beauty in the fact that this is frontal lobe development. Now that I have a child that's in their 20s, this same child with a string tied around his finger, he is so much better about remembering things. Like if I tell him, oh, you have a haircut tomorrow at 10, I hear him driving out of the driveway at 9:45. Like no second reminder, no text. I don't have to say it a million times. And there's just hope for a lot of these kids as their frontal lobe develops, as they learn these best practices and ways of organizing themselves, they will be functional adults and humans someday. So, it's not an overnight thing, and to be patient with your child if they're struggling with these skills.
I feel conflicted in doing this because obviously we have a lot of experience as pediatricians. We've talked to a lot of kids and parents who struggle with executive functioning. I also have experience as a parent, and I do enjoy sharing these things I've learned over the years. But in everything in my parenting, and particularly some of these more difficult issues that we talk about, I approach so much of my parenting with humility and so much of it as a person of faith, praying for my child and for wisdom and how to help them. And I hope that parents see that even in giving these tips and tricks, I completely empathize with how incredibly hard this can be. And I have in no way done any of these things I recommend to perfection. And there are seasons where I do better, and there are seasons where I do poorly, and there are seasons where I'm completely reevaluating what I'm doing. So while we speak with hopes to encourage other parents, I speak with the humility of another parent who struggles through this, and also in no way the expert or authority on this. So I just want to put that out there.
Yes, absolutely.
I would also encourage parents. I hope for some of you, you've listened to this and you feel reassured that what you're experiencing with your child is a normal part of their development. If you've listened to this and you feel more concerned that this might be actually a sign of ADHD or other atypical neurodevelopment, I would really encourage you to go have that discussion with your primary care doctor.
So hopefully in this episode, we've given some tips and tricks on where to start in beginning to teach your children executive functioning, and then how to help them later on, both at home and with additional resources. This is 10 Kids, 2 Docs. I'm Dr. Sylvia Bank.
And I'm Dr. Vivian Carlin. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.
Thank you for listening to 10 Kids, 2 Docs, hosted and created by Sylvia Bank and Vivian Carlin. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and recommend our podcast to other listeners. Visit our website at 10kids2docs.com, where you can find links to social media and leave comments or suggestions. Back next week with more topics in parenting.